The first time Olive Collins noticed Henry Keene, she was sitting in the very last row of folding chairs at the Caldwell Creek town meeting, watching a man she had never seen before settle himself quietly into the corner behind her, as if he belonged nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was the autumn of 1878, and Caldwell Creek, Kansas, was the kind of town that believed in itself a little too loudly. The meeting hall smelled of pine resin and tallow candles, and every chair in the building had been dragged forward to the front rows so that the prominent citizens could be seen agreeing with one another. Olive had taken the last chair at the very back, pressed close to the wall with her wool shawl pulled around her shoulders, because she was new to this town, and she had learned early in life that newcomers who sat too close to the front of things got pulled into arguments before they understood the lay of the land. She was 24 years old. She had arrived in Caldwell Creek 3 weeks prior with a single trunk, a set of schoolteacher credentials issued by the state of Ohio, and enough savings to last her through the winter if she was careful about candles. She had dark hair that she kept pinned severely because loose hair in a schoolroom looked like a woman who had stopped paying attention, and she had sharp gray eyes that had always seen more than she intended to let on. Henry Keene settled into the corner behind her without making a sound, which was a remarkable thing for a man his size. He was broad across the shoulders in the way that mountains are broad, as though he had been shaped by something bigger and slower than ordinary human effort. His coat was heavy canvas, patched at one elbow, and his boots were the kind that had been resoled more than once by someone who actually knew what they were doing. He had a dark beard, not unkempt but not particularly attended to either, and dark eyes that were doing the same thing Olive's eyes were doing, which was watching everything near the front of the room with careful, quiet attention. Olive glanced back at him once. He did not look at her. She faced forward again. Mayor Arden Whitfield was speaking about the new railroad spur that the Santa Fe line was considering routing through the valley 3 miles west of town. Half the room was for it. Half the room was against it. A cattle rancher named Dolph Greer was arguing that the railroad would bring eastern speculators and ruin the open range. A merchant named Sid Farrow was arguing that without the railroad, Caldwell Creek would dry up and blow away within a decade. Both of them were probably right, and neither of them was listening to the other. Olive listened to both sides. She had opinions, but she was 3 weeks new to this town, and she kept them folded inside her chest like a letter she had not yet decided to send. She felt the man in the corner shift his weight, and then she heard him exhale once through his nose in a way that suggested he had just heard someone say something monumentally foolish. She did not turn around, but the corner of her mouth moved in a direction that was not quite a smile. The meeting went on for an hour and a half. The railroad question was tabled for further discussion. Dolph Greer shook hands with Mayor Whitfield and looked like he had won something. Sid Farrow looked like he was already planning how to bring it up again. Everyone stood and began collecting their coats and hats in the way of people who had already started 3 separate conversations before they reached the door. Olive did not stand immediately. She was collecting her thoughts and her shawl, moving at her own pace, which had always been the pace of someone who saw no reason to rush into a crowd. The man behind her stood at the same moment she did. They were the only 2 people in the back of the room, and it was impossible not to acknowledge that. She turned and looked at him directly, the way she had learned to do in schoolrooms because children could sense when you were uncertain and they used it against you. He was looking at her already. He had the look of a man who had been caught and was not sure whether to apologize for it. She said, "I see you back here." He blinked. It was not what he had been expecting her to say, and she could tell by the way something shifted behind his eyes, something that had been braced for something else entirely. "Beg your pardon," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, like water running over flat rock. "Back here," she said, gesturing with a small tilt of her chin at the empty rows of chairs between them and the front of the room. "I see you back here, same as me." He was quiet for a moment. The last of the townspeople were filtering out through the front doors, and the candles on the wall brackets were guttering in the draft. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something between wariness and something warmer that he was keeping under careful guard. "Henry Keene," he said finally. "Olive Collins," she said. He nodded once, as if her name was information he intended to keep. Then he picked up his hat from where it rested on the windowsill behind him and put it on, and he said, "Good evening, Miss Collins." And he went out through the side door without any further explanation of himself, and she stood alone in the back of the emptied meeting hall with the distinct and unusual sensation of having just spoken to someone she was not finished speaking to. She found out about him the way you found things out in small Kansas towns in 1878, which was slowly and in fragments. The woman who ran the boarding house where Olive was staying, a square-shouldered widow named Mrs. Loretta Hatch, knew something about everyone who had ever passed through Caldwell Creek, and she arranged this knowledge in the order of her own opinions rather than any chronological sequence. Henry Keene, as Loretta Hatch told it across the kitchen table over 2 consecutive breakfasts, was a trapper and sometime guide who had come down out of the northern Colorado Rockies some years back and bought 40 acres of scrubby land 3 miles east of town along the Cimarron tributary. He had built a cabin that was apparently solid enough to have survived 2 bad winters without losing its roof, which was more than could be said for most structures in the territory. He kept to himself. He came to town for supplies and for the occasional town meeting where he sat in the back and never spoke, and he went home again. He had no wife. He had no known family in the territory. He was, according to Loretta Hatch, perfectly pleasant when spoken to, but the kind of man who had been alone long enough that company seemed to require some effort from him. "What does he trap?" Olive asked. "Whatever the mountains have in them," said Loretta Hatch. "Beaver mostly in the early days. But the beaver trade's been dying out since the 40s. He guides hunting parties sometimes, takes men up through the passes in the summer. Some of the wealthy Eastern gentlemen who come out looking for adventure." She said the word adventure with the tone of a woman who found the whole concept mildly offensive. Olive turned her coffee cup in its saucer. "Has he lived here long?" 3-4 years. Before that I believe he was further north, Wyoming country, maybe Montana." Loretta Hatch looked at Olive over her own cup with an expression of mild professional interest. "Why do you ask?" "I spoke to him at the meeting," Olive said. "He seemed like someone worth knowing." Loretta Hatch set down her cup. "He's the sort of man," she said carefully, "who keeps everything he is somewhere you cannot easily get to." "That's interesting," Olive said. Loretta Hatch looked at her as if she had just said something that could go 2 different ways, and it was too early to tell which. The school in Caldwell Creek occupied a single large room on the northern edge of town. It had been built the previous year out of necessity, because the number of children in the area had finally reached a count that embarrassed the town into organizing proper instruction. There were 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they were collectively the most energetic and contrary group of human beings Olive had encountered since her own childhood, which was saying something. She loved them immediately. She set the older ones to helping the younger ones with their letters, which gave her 2 advantages at once. It kept the older students engaged, and it gave the younger ones models of something achievable. She organized the schoolroom so that the morning light came through the window onto the reading area, and she brought books from her trunk that she had carried from Ohio, some of which she had owned since she was a girl and treated with corresponding reverence. She was good at her work. She had always been good at her work, which was one of the things she had never needed anyone to tell her. The second town gathering happened 3 weeks after the first. This time, a Sunday church service held in the meeting hall because the actual church building was having its floor replaced after a winter flooding issue. The preacher, a lean man named Reverend Stokes who looked like he had been put together in a hurry, delivered a sermon about the virtue of patience that was itself not particularly patient. People shuffled on their benches. Children were subdued with various degrees of success. Olive took the back row again. Old habits and honest preferences were the same thing to her. She did not look toward the corner where Henry Keene had stood 3 weeks ago. She was listening to the sermon and thinking about a mathematics lesson she was planning for Monday morning, and she had no reason to look toward the corner, and she was not looking toward the corner. Then she looked toward the corner. He was there. He was not looking at her. He was looking toward the front of the hall the way he had been looking at the front of the hall the last time, with that careful, measuring attention that seemed to take in everything without necessarily committing to an opinion about any of it. His hat was in his hands this time, turned brim over brim in a slow, absent movement that suggested he was thinking about something else entirely, while the rest of him sat still and waited for the service to end. Olive faced forward again. The Reverend was talking about the patience of Job. Olive was not thinking about the patience of Job. She was thinking about the way Henry Keene had said her name the first time she told it to him, as if he were putting it somewhere specific, somewhere he could find it again. After the service, the congregation stood and did what congregations do, which is cluster and talk, and avoid the people they have complicated feelings about while engaging enthusiastically with the people they have uncomplicated feelings about. Olive accepted a kind word from the school board chairman, a Mr. Everett Doss, who told her the children had been coming home and repeating things she had said, which he seemed to find both impressive and faintly alarming. She chatted briefly with a young woman her age named Clara Finch, who ran the millinery, and who had the sort of bright, rapid manner of speaking that Olive found charming in small doses. When she turned to leave through the side door, Henry Keene was standing near it. He was not standing near it in a way that suggested he had been waiting. He was standing near it in a way that suggested he had happened to need to leave through that door at approximately the same time she did. But they both knew that the main doors at the front of the hall were 20 feet away, and the side door required walking the entire length of the back wall to reach, and neither of them had any practical reason to be at this end of the building unless they had both, separately, decided they preferred this particular exit. "Mr. Keene," she said. "Miss Collins," he said. They went out through the side door together, which put them on the narrow alley between the meeting hall and the feed store, which was not the most romantic stretch of Caldwell Creek's geography, but which had the considerable advantage of being entirely empty. "The sermon was long," she observed. "They generally are," he said. "Do you find them useful?" He considered this. She was beginning to understand that he considered things before he said them, not because he was slow but because he was precise, because he did not want to say a thing he would have to take back or qualify later. "Sometimes," he said. "Today, not particularly." "Patience," she said. "I've got enough of it," he said, and there was something dry in it that made her look at him sideways to see if he meant it as humor, and he did. She could tell by the very slight shift at the corner of his mouth, the suggestion of a smile, that he kept from going any further the way you'd keep a horse from breaking into a run on uncertain ground. "Are you going to the planning discussion next Tuesday?" she asked. The town had scheduled a working meeting about the schoolhouse expansion, which Olive had a direct professional stake in. "I hadn't thought about it," he said. "You should," she said. "The back row will be occupied, but there is usually enough room." He looked at her with that look she was coming to recognize, the look of a man who had been startled by something and was deciding what to do with the surprise. "I'll think on it," he said. They walked together as far as the corner of Main Street, and then they went in opposite directions without making any formal arrangement to do otherwise, and Olive walked back to Loretta Hatch's boarding house with her shawl wrapped around her, and the autumn air cutting sharp and clean off the prairie, and she thought that she had not had a conversation that interested her this much in quite some time. He came to the planning discussion on Tuesday. He sat in the back. So did she. They did not sit together, exactly. There were 2 empty chairs between them, but they were unmistakably the 2 people at the back of the room who were paying close attention to everything, while appearing to take very little of it seriously. The discussion was about whether to add a second room to the schoolhouse to accommodate the younger children separately from the older ones. Olive had strong feelings about this. She expressed them when called upon by Everett Doss, speaking clearly and with the particular economy of language that was her natural mode, laying out her reasons in an order that made it difficult to argue with them, without first admitting that you had not thought it through as carefully as she had. When she finished speaking and sat back down, she heard Henry Keene make a quiet sound behind her, low and brief, that she was reasonably certain was the sound of someone who had just heard a point made well and was acknowledging it privately. She filed this away. After the meeting, they walked together to the corner again. This time there was something between them that had not been there before, not exactly, or rather something that had been there before was sitting closer to the surface now. "You're good at arguing," he said. "I'm good at being clear," she said. "It isn't the same thing." "Better than arguing," he said. "In a schoolroom it is," she agreed. "You can argue with children for hours and nobody wins, but if you're clear with them, they usually get where you want them to go before either of you realizes you were going." He was quiet for a few steps. "You like the work," he said. "It was not a question." "I love it," she said, and the simplicity of it surprised even her, the way it came out so directly, as if this man's habit of precision had already begun to affect her own speech. "I love it enormously. Children are honest in a way adults have generally decided is inconvenient." He made a sound that was closer to an actual laugh than anything she had heard from him yet. It was quiet and brief, and it transformed his face for the moment it was there, and Olive felt something move in her chest that she immediately catalogued as something to be careful about. The autumn deepened. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold and then skeletal. The school held its first examination day, and 3 of Olive's students read aloud to the assembled parents with enough confidence that 2 mothers cried and 1 father shook Olive's hand so long and firmly that she had to gently extract her own fingers. She was making her place in Caldwell Creek the way she made her place in most things, not by announcing herself, but by doing good work and letting it speak for her. She and Henry Keene had developed what she supposed you would have to call a pattern, though it had never been discussed or agreed upon. At every gathering, meeting, service, or public occasion in Caldwell Creek, they both sat at the back. Sometimes they spoke during, in the way of 2 people sharing a section of room and an unspoken agreement about the nature of the proceedings. Mostly they spoke after, walking as far as the corner of Main Street, sometimes a little further along whichever of their routes overlapped. The conversations ranged. They talked about the railroad question, which was still unresolved. They talked about the changing seasons and what Henry said they would mean for the winter, which he had read more carefully than the almanac. They talked about Ohio, which he had never been to, and about the Rockies, which she had never seen. "Why did you leave them?" she asked one evening in October, the question coming out before she had fully decided to ask it. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. They were walking along the edge of town, where the road turned to open grass, and the sky overhead was enormous and purple with a sunset that looked like something painted by someone who had never seen Kansas and was trying to imagine it all at once. "The trapping life was becoming what it had always been going to become," he said finally. "The animals thin out when you take too many. The good passes get crowded with men who think the mountain is an object you can use up." He paused. "I needed to be somewhere that was still growing instead of somewhere that had been taken apart. And Caldwell Creek is growing," she said. "Too fast," he said, "in some ways, but at least it's still deciding what it's going to be." "That's why you go to the meetings," she said, "even though you never speak at them." He glanced at her. "You notice that." "Of course I notice that. You are clearly paying attention. You have opinions. You just don't express them in the room." "Rooms full of people arguing past each other aren't generally where the deciding gets done," he said. "The deciding gets done in smaller conversations later. Conversations like this one," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes. "Yes," he said. Like this one. Something in the word yes, in the quiet directness of it, settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. November arrived and brought with it the first hard frost, a cattle incident involving Dolph Greer's fences and two of his neighbors' horses that had the whole town taking sides, and a letter from Olive's mother in Ohio asking when she was coming home. Olive wrote back and said she was not coming home. She had a school to run, and the school needed her. She did not say anything else about why she was not coming home, because her reasons were still assembling themselves into something she could name. She had been thinking about Henry Keene in the way you think about a fire when you are cold, not obsessively, not irrationally, but with the consistent, honest attention of someone who recognizes a source of warmth and wants to understand it better. She thought about the way he listened. She thought about the economy of his speech, and the depth that economy suggested behind it. She thought about the fact that he chose the back of every room because he understood something about the nature of observation, that seeing clearly required some distance, and she thought that she understood this same thing in her bones, and that very few people she had known understood it the way he seemed to. She was also, she admitted to herself on a cold November night while grading spelling exercises by lamplight, afraid. Not of him. Henry Keene had nothing threatening about him except the size of his silences, and Olive had never been frightened by silence. She was afraid of the wanting. She had been careful with herself for a long time. She had built a life on the foundation of her own capability, her own usefulness, her own clear-eyed independence, and she knew from observation that wanting someone too much could threaten the foundation if you let it, if you were not very careful about where you put your weight. But she thought that Henry Keene might be someone worth being less careful about. This was either the wisest thing she had ever considered or the most dangerous, and she could not yet tell which. The first snow of the season came in mid-November, light and exploratory, the kind of snow that seems to be checking whether the ground is ready before committing to any serious effort. Olive was walking from the school back to the boarding house after a late afternoon of lesson preparation when she heard a horse approaching from the eastern road and looked up to see Henry Keene on a brown mare that had the calm, sensible look of an animal that had worked alongside this particular man long enough to trust his judgment completely. He pulled up alongside her without any fanfare. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said. She kept walking. He walked the horse alongside her at her pace. "Cold night to be walking," he observed. "It's not far," she said. "I like the cold, actually. It makes you think more precisely." He said nothing to this for a few steps. "Then I'm heading into town for supplies. I've got room in the saddlebag if you need anything brought back." It was such a practical offer that she nearly laughed. "I think I'm fine," she said, "but thank you." "There's a storm coming in 3 days," he said. "Not the almanac kind, the real kind. I'd stock extra if you have the chance." She looked up at him on the horse, at the serious, careful way he said this, and she understood that this was not casual conversation, that he had ridden into town at least partly to say this to her, that he had been paying attention to what the weather was going to do and had thought specifically about whether she knew. "How can you tell?" she asked. "The way the elk have been moving east," he said, "and the pattern the clouds have been sitting in over the western ridge for the past 4 days. The pressure's wrong." He said it the way a man says a thing he knows absolutely without needing to convince anyone of it. "I'll get extra flour," she said. "And lamp oil," he said. "And lamp oil," she agreed. He touched the brim of his hat. "Good night, Miss Collins." "Good night, Mr. Keene." He rode on. She walked the last 300 yards to the boarding house thinking about elk moving east and pressure being wrong, and the fact that a man who had been perfectly capable of not coming into town today had come into town today to tell her about a storm. The storm hit on the 4th day, not the 3rd, which meant he had been off by 1 day, but off in the more forgiving direction. It hit the way real storms hit on the southern Kansas plain, comprehensively and without apology, dropping 18 inches in less than 24 hours, and sealing everything in a white silence so complete that Olive stood at her boarding house window on the first morning and felt that the world had rearranged itself overnight into something cleaner and more absolute. The school was closed for 3 days. Most of the town's public life ground down to the essential: the feed store, the saloon, Mrs. Abramson's mercantile, the practical operations of people trying to keep themselves and their animals warm. Olive used the time to grade papers she had been putting off and to read from her own books and to consider, with the clarity that deep snow and closed roads and a certain amount of involuntary solitude provides, what she was going to do about the fact that she was unambiguously falling in love with a mountain man who sat at the back of every gathering in Caldwell Creek. She had not told anyone this. She was not the kind of person who spoke aloud about things before she had decided how she felt about them. But she was decided now, sitting on her narrow bed at Loretta Hatch's boarding house with snow piling against the window glass and a copy of Middlemarch open on her knee. She was decided, and the certainty of it was not frightening the way she had expected. It was more like finally naming something she had been walking around for weeks, a relief in the naming rather than an alarm. The question was what to do about it. The question, more specifically, was whether Henry Keene felt the same thing, and if so, whether he knew it, and if so, whether he intended to do anything about it, and if not, whether she ought to, and whether she was the kind of woman who did things like that. She decided by the third day of the storm that she was exactly that kind of woman. She had crossed a state line by herself at 22 and taken a teaching post in a town where she knew no one because it was a good position, and she was qualified for it. She had no particular history of waiting for things to come to her when she could reasonably go to them. The snow cleared on the 5th day. Life reconstituted itself. The children came back to school pink-cheeked and full of stories about what they had done during the storm, most of which involved snow in some fashion and several of which involved their parents in states of mild exasperation. Olive listened to all of it with genuine pleasure, and then taught them a lesson about the physics of snowflake formation, which she had read about in a scientific periodical she had brought from Ohio, because she believed in turning every experience into a doorway into understanding. She saw Henry Keene at the end of that week, at a Saturday evening gathering at the community hall that was not precisely a dance but had dancing in it, organized by the town's social committee as a way of restoring morale after the storm. Olive came because she had been invited by Clara Finch, and because she liked dancing more than she generally admitted. She wore her gray dress, which was better than her brown dress but not as formal as the blue one, which she judged to be a level of formality this particular occasion did not require. Henry Keene was there, which she had been hoping for without permitting herself to plan on. He was standing in the back corner of the hall beside a support post, watching the dancers with an expression of quiet, benign observation that was his natural resting state in any public space. He was wearing a clean shirt under his coat, dark blue, and his beard was neatly trimmed. And Olive noticed this the way you notice things you are already paying close attention to. She went and stood near him, not immediately. She spent a half-hour talking with Clara and 2 other women whose names she was still getting straight, but eventually she made her way to the back corner with 2 cups of the apple cider the social committee had provided, and she held one out to him. He took it. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said. "The storm lasted 5 days. 4.5, he said. "I was off by half a day." "You predicted it 2 days ahead," she said. "That seems like a reasonable margin." "Not for practical purposes," he said, and she could hear in his voice the mild severity of a man who held himself to precise standards in matters of observation, who thought that being almost right was a useful category but not an acceptable destination. "You came into town to warn me," she said. He looked at his cider. "That was thoughtful," she said, because she had decided to say it and she was not going to unsay it. "Just practical," he said. "It can be both," she said. The fiddle player struck up a reel, and several couples moved onto the cleared floor space in the center of the hall, and the room reorganized itself around the music in the way that rooms do, some people drawn forward, some pressed back. Henry Keene and Olive Collins remained at the back, which was where they always were, and she thought that there was something very right about this, that they were both the kind of people who watched first and moved later and knew their own minds about when to do which. "Mr. Keene," she said, "do you intend to spend the rest of your life in the back corner of every room in Caldwell Creek without ever once asking a woman to dance?" The question came out more directly than she had planned, which was, she supposed, the hazard of having decided things during a snowstorm. There was no graceful way to take it back, and she did not particularly want to. He looked at her. The music was going, and around them the hall was full of noise and movement, but the back corner where they stood was its own small country, and inside that country the question was sitting between them with all the patience in the world. "I don't dance particularly well," he said. "Neither do I," she said, "but I've found that not doing a thing particularly well is often insufficient reason not to do it." His mouth moved. The smile was still restrained, still that held-back thing, but it had gotten further this time. It reached his eyes, and Olive felt something in her own chest respond to it with an enthusiasm she attributed to the cider only briefly before admitting to herself that the cider had nothing to do with it. He put down his cup on the windowsill behind him and held out his hand. She put her cup down next to his and took it. His hand was large and very warm and had the particular solidity of a hand that had done a great deal of real work, and the contact of it sent something through her that she had not felt in years, something that started at her palm and traveled up her arm and arrived somewhere near her heart with the announcement that it intended to stay. They danced. He was not good at it, as promised. He was too careful with his feet and had the look of a man counting silently, and she was not particularly good at it either. She had a tendency to lead slightly on the turns, which was an old habit from dancing with shorter partners. But they managed, and there was something about their combined imprecision that made it work in a way that polished dancing sometimes did not, because they were both paying attention, both compensating for the other in small ways, both trying. When the reel ended, they stepped back from each other with the flushed, slightly winded quality of two people who have just discovered something they are going to have to think about. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he said, and meant it differently, she could tell, meant it for more than the dancing. They walked out of the hall at the end of the evening side by side, out into the cold air and the clear black sky that had come after the storm, full of stars in the way Kansas skies are full of stars, unreasonably, almost aggressively full of stars, as if the sky were making a point about the scale of things. Henry Keene walked her back to the boarding house, which was a longer walk than the corner of Main Street. At the door he said, "Olive." It was the first time he had used her name without the miss. She registered this with her whole body. "Henry," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the starlight. Then he said, "I am not a man who speaks easily about himself." "I know," she said, "but I would like to speak to you about myself if you'd be willing." "I have been willing," she said, "since October." The smile came again, and this time it did not stop where it usually did. This time it went the full distance, and it was the most remarkable transformation, the way it changed his whole face, opening something in it that was usually so carefully held that you might have thought it wasn't there at all. "Friday evening," he said. "There's a place on the creek where the ice comes in clean this time of year. I thought you might want to see it." "Yes," she said, and she was not talking about the ice, and they both knew it. He touched the brim of his hat and said good night and walked back toward where he had left his horse, and Olive went inside and stood in the front hallway for a moment with her hand on the banister, thinking that she was, without any question, entirely done for. Loretta Hatch appeared from the kitchen with a lamp and an expression of severe perceptiveness. "You look warm for a cold night," she observed. "I danced," Olive said. "You danced," said Loretta Hatch, in the tone of a woman who was filing this information under a more accurate heading. Friday arrived with the cooperative splendor of a late November afternoon that had decided, against all seasonal precedent, to be beautiful. The sky was the deep, achingly clear blue that comes after cold fronts have pushed through and taken all the haze with them, and the light lay flat and gold across the dead grass and the ice along the creek's edge. Henry met her at the edge of town with his brown mare and a second horse borrowed from the livery, a smaller gray with a good temperament. Olive had ridden growing up, not extensively but enough, and she settled into the saddle with the comfortable recognition of a body remembering something it had always known. They rode east along the creek for about a mile, to a bend where the water ran shallow over limestone, and the ice had built up in shelf formations along both banks. Not dangerous ice, not the kind that indicated the whole creek was about to lock solid, but the decorative, elaborate ice of running water caught in the act of freezing, built up in forms that had no practical purpose and were purely, extravagantly beautiful. Henry dismounted and helped her down, and they walked to the edge together. The ice caught the late afternoon light and held it in the way ice does, scattered and multiplied, hundreds of small light sources where there had been one. "I have not seen anything like this," she said, and meant it completely. "Every year it forms differently," he said. "Depends on the temperature pattern and how fast the water drops, never the same twice." She looked at him standing beside her in the gold light, this large, quiet man who had ridden into town to warn her about a storm and who had danced with her like a man counting steps, and she thought that she wanted to understand everything about him, all the things stored in the careful silences, all the things he kept somewhere you could not easily get to. "Tell me about the mountains," she said. He did. He talked about the Rockies in the way that people talk about a place they love that they have also left, with a tenderness that is complicated by the leaving. He told her about the winters at elevation, the way the cold was a different quality of cold than the plains cold, drier and more absolute. He told her about the silence at altitude, the way it was different from all other silences, the way you could hear yourself think with a clarity you could not achieve at lower elevations. He told her about elk in the fall and about the way the aspens turned, and about a pass he had crossed in July 3 years ago in a thunderstorm with a hunting party from Philadelphia, the lightning coming down on the ridge above them and all the eastern men terrified, and he had been able to get them down safely because he knew the mountain and the mountain was not, fundamentally, his enemy. "Why did you really leave?" she asked, softer now because it was different here by the ice in the gold light than it was on a street corner in November dark. It was closer, and she wanted the real answer. He was quiet for a long moment. "I lost someone up there," he said finally. "A friend. His name was Marcus Webb. We'd been working the northern trapping routes together for 6 years. He went through ice on a lake in March of '74. He said it without flinching, but also without any of the defenses people usually put around loss when they speak of it to someone they do not know well. He said it plainly, the way a man says the truest things. After that, the mountains felt like they had a price I couldn't keep paying." "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the full weight of the phrase, not as a pleasantry but as the genuine thing. "I came down out of it," he said. "Found this piece of land, built on it." He looked at the ice. "I've been trying to decide what to do next with considerable patience. For 4 years," she said. "Some decisions take time," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Henry," she said. "Olive," he said. They were standing close enough together that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold air. She reached out and put her hand on his arm through the coat, just the weight of her hand, and felt him go very still, not tense, not withdrawn, but still the way deep water is still, present in all its depth and waiting. "I think," she said carefully, "that some decisions have already been made and only need to be spoken." He turned to look at her fully. In the gold light his dark eyes were the most serious, most awake, most present she had ever seen them, and she thought that this was the man behind all the patience and all the distance. This was what was in there, this attention, this care, this enormous careful wanting. "I'm not easy to know," he said. It was not a warning exactly, more like information he felt she deserved to have. "I know that," she said. "I'm not particularly easy either." "No," he said, and there was warmth in it. "You're not." "So we're well matched," she said. He made a sound that was fully a laugh this time, genuine and unguarded, brief but complete, and she loved the sound of it so much she wanted to memorize it. Then he put his hand over hers where it rested on his arm, covering it entirely with the warm solidity of his palm, and he said, "I would like to court you, Miss Collins, properly, if you'll permit it." "Mr. Keene," she said, "I have been practically sending engraved invitations since October." "I received them," he said. "I was just making sure I understood them correctly." They rode back toward town in the deep blue of early evening, the stars just beginning to emerge, and the horses walking at their own easy pace. And it was one of the finest evenings Olive Collins had ever spent in her life, and she had spent several evenings that she thought at the time were the finest, and this one was better than all of them. Winter deepened and the courtship took the shape of the two people conducting it, deliberate and genuinely interested, and full of the pleasure of two careful people discovering that they have found in each other someone worth being less careful with. Henry came to town twice a week, sometimes 3 times. He brought firewood on several occasions, cutting and splitting it with a thoroughness that resulted in Loretta Hatch having more firewood than she had possessed in several years, a situation she accepted without protest. He sat across from Olive at Loretta's kitchen table and drank coffee and talked, and the talking deepened steadily, the way conversations deepen when two people are serious about each other and willing to use the time. He told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, a mining town that no longer existed in the form he had left it, a father who had worked underground and come up gray with it and died of lung problems when Henry was 16. He told her about coming west at 18 with nothing but a good knife and more stubbornness than was practical, and how he had learned the mountains from an older trapper named Abel Croft, who had eventually walked off into the back country one spring and not come back out, which was apparently how Abel Croft had always intended to finish. She told him about Ohio, about the schoolteacher who had taught her at 11 that being smart was not the same as being useful, and that the distinction mattered enormously. She told him about her younger sister Nora, who had married at 19 and seemed happy about it, and her parents, who were good and loving people who found Olive slightly difficult to understand, not in a hurtful way, more in the way of parents watching a bird they raised that turned out to be a different species than they expected. "They thought you'd marry," he said. "They expected it," she said. "I wasn't opposed to it in theory. I just never found anyone who improved on solitude by enough to make the adjustment worth it." He was quiet with this for a moment. "And now," he said, she looked at him across the table. "Now I am under the distinct impression," she said, "that you improve on solitude by an enormous margin." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and the simple directness of the gesture, the same gesture she had made by the ice, mirrored back to her, undid something in her chest that she had not known was wound up. Christmas came. The town organized a Christmas celebration in the meeting hall that included carol singing, a reading by Reverend Stokes that was much better than his usual work, because he had bothered to prepare it, and a potluck supper at which Olive brought a molasses cake from a recipe of Loretta Hatch's that received more compliments than Olive felt were entirely warranted by the level of skill involved. Henry came. He brought a jar of honey from a neighbor's bees and a small, perfectly made wooden box that he put into Olive's hands without ceremony when they found each other in the back of the hall, as they always found each other in the back of the hall, as if some compass between them always pointed to the same back corner. She opened the box. Inside was a small piece of carved quartz from what she immediately recognized, from his descriptions, as the high Colorado country. It was clear with a slight rose cast, and he had carved a simple flower on its flat face, nothing elaborate but precise and careful and done with evident attention. "You made this," she said. "Winter evenings," he said, as if it required no further explanation. She held it and felt the weight of the weeks it represented, the patient evenings alone in his cabin with the winter outside and his hands finding something to do with the wanting until he could come to town and sit across from her at a kitchen table. "Thank you," she said. "Merry Christmas, Olive," he said. "Merry Christmas, Henry," she said. That night at the end of the celebration, standing outside in the snow on the walk back to the boarding house, he kissed her for the first time. It was not theatrical. He was not a theatrical man. It was simply and completely the kiss of a man who had been intending this for some time and was finally doing the thing he intended, warm and deliberate and full of everything the silences had been holding. She kissed him back the same way. The winter finished. Spring came to southern Kansas in the gradual, incremental way it always came, not in a single announcement, but in a series of small arguments won against the cold. A warmer day here, mud returning to the road there, the cottonwoods beginning to think about leaves along the creek bed. The prairie turned green in a color that always surprised Olive slightly even when she was expecting it, that specific vivid green of new grass on flat land with nothing to compete with it. Olive's school had grown. The town had approved the expansion. The second room was under construction, and she had been given permission to hire an assistant teacher for the fall, which felt like a considerable institutional vote of confidence. She was known in Caldwell Creek by now, not a newcomer anymore but a fixed point, one of the people the town had absorbed into its understanding of itself. She and Henry had been seen enough together that it was not news anymore. Clara Finch had said with typical directness in February, "Well, everyone knows you two are courting, Olive. We might as well stop pretending we're not all watching." And Olive had said, "I was not under the impression it was a secret," and Clara had looked satisfied and moved on. There was an evening in April, the sort of evening that April in Kansas sometimes offers as evidence of its better nature, warm enough for sitting outside. The sky still light at 7 o'clock, and the air carrying the smell of new grass and creek water, when Henry came to the boarding house and they sat on the front step instead of inside at the kitchen table. He had been quiet for most of the evening, not the comfortable quiet that she had come to know and love in him, but a thinking quiet, a working toward something quiet, and she waited it out because she trusted the quiets now. She knew there was always something in them. "I want to show you the land," he said finally. "The 40 acres, the cabin." He paused. "I've wanted to for a while." "I'd like that," she said. "I want you to see it before you decide anything," he said. She looked at him. "Henry, what is it you think I'm deciding?" He looked back at her with the full, unguarded honesty that she had come to understand was the most truthful version of him, the one behind all the patience and precision. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "but I want you to see the place first. I want you to see if it's a life you'd want to live. I'm not asking you to come into something without knowing what it is." Olive was quiet for a moment. On the road in front of the boarding house, a wagon went by with 2 children in the back waving at nothing in particular, and she watched it pass and thought about everything Henry Keene was. "You could just ask," she said. "I know," he said, "but I want to do it right." "Showing me your land is right," she agreed. He picked up her hand from where it rested on the step between them and held it, and they sat there in the April evening with the light going and the prairie settling into its nighttime sounds, the frogs starting up along the creek and the first stars appearing, and she thought that she had never been happier to sit still somewhere in her life. The following Saturday he brought both horses and they rode east, and then south to where his 40 acres sat in the curve of the land, and she saw the cabin for the first time. It was solid, as advertised by Loretta Hatch's original assessment, built of local stone and heavy timber with a covered porch along the south side that faced the open grassland and the distant fold of low hills. It was not large, but it was not small either. It was honest. It looked exactly like a place built by a man who knew what he was doing, and had done it carefully because he understood that a shelter is not a luxury. There was a kitchen garden space already laid out behind the cabin, winter bare, but clearly organized by someone who had thought about sun and water and soil. There was a well with a properly fitted cover. There was a small barn with 2 stalls and a hay loft and enough room for equipment. There were cottonwoods along the eastern edge of the property that would make shade in summer, and she could see where the tributary ran below a slight rise to the north, the same creek whose ice she had stood beside in November, and understood that she was falling in love. She stood on the porch and looked out at the southern grass and the hills and the enormous, generous Kansas sky. "Henry," she said. "It's not the mountains," he said. He was standing a few feet behind her with his hat in his hands, watching her face with that careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "No," she said. "But it's good." She turned to face him. "It's very good." He stepped toward her. "Will you be my wife?" he said. He said it straight, without decoration, in the same direct and certain way he said the truest things. "Yes," she said, and she said it the same way, and the word passed between them like a stone settling into permanent ground. He put his hat on the porch railing, and he put his hands on either side of her face with extraordinary gentleness, and he kissed her there on the porch of the cabin that was about to become both of their homes, with the prairie spread out behind her and the April sky above them. And she put her hands against his chest, and felt his heart beating, and thought that all the careful wanting of the past months had been exactly the right preparation for this. That everything had been building toward the particular rightness of this moment. They were married at the end of May, in the meeting hall because it was the largest space in Caldwell Creek, on a Saturday afternoon that was perfect in the way of May Saturdays that have decided to demonstrate what May is capable of. The town came, because the town had been watching this unfold with collective investment since at least December, and there was the particular pleasure in attendance that comes when people feel they have witnessed something arriving at its proper conclusion. Olive wore the blue dress. It was the right occasion for it. Reverend Stokes conducted the service with more warmth than his sermons generally allowed him, possibly because weddings had always suited him better than either funerals or the patience of job. Loretta Hatch occupied the front row and did not cry until the vows, at which point she cried with the efficient thoroughness of a woman who had been keeping it in and had decided enough was enough. Clara Finch stood next to her and supplied handkerchiefs. Henry stood at the front of the hall looking like a man who had come a very long way to get here and was profoundly glad he had made the journey. And when Olive walked toward him through the assembled Caldwell Creek population, his expression was everything she had ever seen behind the quiets and the patience, entirely undisguised, completely present. The vows they spoke were simple and genuine, which was the only kind either of them would have found acceptable. At the celebration afterward, held in the hall with the furniture pushed back and Mrs. Abramson's incredible dried apple pies distributed freely and a fiddle player who was considerably better than the one at the November dance, Henry Keene and Olive Collins danced together for the second time, and this time he did not count his steps at all. Marriage, as it turned out, suited both of them in the ways that mattered most. They were two people who had been alone for long enough that they understood solitude. They did not need to fill every space between them with noise, and this meant that the silences in the cabin on the 40 acres were comfortable rather than uneasy, full rather than empty. They had their rhythms quickly, not because they had forced them, but because they were both people who paid attention to how things worked and adjusted accordingly. Olive continued her school. Henry continued his guiding work and began developing the land more seriously, building a second pasture fence and planting a larger kitchen garden that showed an understanding of soil preparation she had not known he possessed until she saw it. He was not a farmer by training, but he was a man who learned things when he decided they were worth learning, and he had decided the land was worth learning. In the fall of 1879, Olive became pregnant. She discovered this in September and told Henry on a Sunday morning across the kitchen table with the same directness she brought to all things. He was quiet for the short moment of a man receiving news that has rearranged his world. Then he stood up from his chair and came around the table and held her in the way of a man who is extremely careful with something he loves enormously, and he said into her hair, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "More than well." "Good," he said. He held on for a moment longer. "Good." The pregnancy was uncomplicated in most of the ways that mattered, which was not to say it was easy, because it was not easy, particularly the winter months. But Olive was constitutionally disinclined to complain about physical difficulty, and Henry was constitutionally inclined to pay close attention to everything she needed without being asked, which was a useful combination. The baby was born in June of 1880, on the longest day of the year, which Olive later said was entirely appropriate for a child who had entered the world with the maximum possible advantage of daylight. The midwife was a capable woman named Mrs. Dolores Varga, who had delivered half the children in the county, and who treated childbirth with the brisk competence of someone who respected it without being intimidated by it. The baby was a boy. Henry held him in the first hour with the look of a man who had been presented with something so far outside all his previous experience of the world that he had no adequate response for it except stillness. And so he was still, completely and utterly still, looking at his son with an expression that Olive, exhausted and triumphant from the foot of the bed, recognized as the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face. They named him Samuel Marcus Keene. Samuel because Olive had always liked the name, and because the biblical Samuel had been, as far as she was concerned, one of the more sensible figures in the Old Testament. Marcus for Henry's friend Marcus Webb, who had gone through the ice in March of 1874, and whom Henry had never stopped carrying somewhere inside him, and who deserved, Olive thought, to have his name continue in the world in the form of something living. Henry stood on the porch with Samuel the evening of his birth, after Dolores Varga had gone, and Olive was sleeping the deep, necessary sleep of someone who had worked harder than anyone in the past 12 hours. And he held his son and looked at the Kansas evening sky, and he told Samuel about the mountains, not because Samuel understood any of it, but because the telling seemed necessary. Because there were things a man needed to say in the presence of someone new to the world, who did not yet know what the world was and therefore could be told honestly. Caldwell Creek continued to grow and change around them in the way that Kansas cattle towns in the early 1880s grew and changed, which was sometimes exciting and sometimes alarming, and always reminding everyone of the basic impermanence of things that seemed permanent. The railroad question was finally resolved in the spring of 1881, when the Santa Fe line made its decision to route the spur 2 miles north of town rather than 3 miles west, which meant that both Dolph Greer and Sid Farrow got part of what they wanted, and both could claim partial victory, which turned out to be an entirely satisfactory political solution for a town that had been arguing about it for 3 years. The railroad brought change, as railroads did. It brought more settlers and more commerce, and it brought the particular kind of Eastern money that was already buying up large tracts of Kansas land and turning it from open range to fenced and divided property. It brought a new hotel that replaced the boarding house where Olive had stayed when she first arrived, though Loretta Hatch herself retired to live with her daughter in Wichita before the hotel was finished, and Olive visited her twice before Loretta died in 1884 at the age of 71, having expressed complete satisfaction with the way things had turned out for people she cared about. Henry navigated these changes with his characteristic careful attention. He was not resistant to progress for its own sake, but he was thoughtful about which changes benefited the land, and which ones benefited only the people who owned it for short periods. He served on the town planning committee for 2 years in the early 1880s, which surprised most people who had known him only as the man who sat at the back and never spoke. And he turned out to be precisely as useful there, as Olive had always expected he would be, saying less than anyone else at meetings, and consistently saying the most important things. She attended those meetings too, as often as she could, and she still sat in the back row when she wasn't needed at the front. And sometimes they sat together, and sometimes they sat at opposite ends of the back row, and communicated across the length of it in the way of two people who had been paying attention to each other long enough that they could hold entire conversations without speaking. The school expansion was completed in 1881. The second room was used for the younger students, and Olive hired as her assistant a young woman named Frances Aldridge, fresh from a teaching college in Missouri, who was earnest and industrious and slightly overwhelmed by the Caldwell Creek children, but improving daily. Olive thought that Frances reminded her somewhat of herself at 22, before she had learned that confidence was primarily a skill you developed rather than a quality you either had or lacked. Samuel grew. He was a serious child, dark-haired and dark-eyed like Henry, with Olive's habit of observation and her tendency to listen before speaking, which combination produced a boy who was very quiet and extremely perceptive, and who could, by the age of 4, tell you things about what was happening in the room around him that adults had been certain he had not noticed. In the autumn of 1882, Olive discovered she was pregnant again. This time she told Henry in the evening, on the porch, with Samuel asleep inside, and the October sky above them full of the particular stars she had come to love most because they were the ones she had first seen from this porch on her first night in this house. And Henry held her the same way he had held her the first time, completely and carefully, and said into her hair, "Are you well?" Because this was the question he always asked first, because for Henry Keene, the well-being of this woman was the first and most essential data point in any situation. "I am very well," she said. The second child was a girl, born in May of 1883, and they named her Eleanor, for Olive's grandmother, who had been a woman of forthright opinions and enormous practical capability, both of which Olive suspected Eleanor would inherit in full measure. Henry held Eleanor with the same devastating stillness he had held Samuel, but with something added to it now, some deeper knowing, because he understood now what he had not known 3 years ago, which was that this small creature would grow into someone specific, someone particular, someone who would fill a space in his life that he could not have imagined the shape of before she arrived to define it. The years between 1883 and 1886 were the years of the life they had built becoming fully itself, settling into the shape that it would hold. Samuel started school at Olive's school, which presented certain complications in terms of his mother being his teacher, complications they navigated by being, between themselves, extremely clear about which role was which at which time. Eleanor walked at 10 months and talked at 11, and showed every sign of having arrived in the world with a complete and operational opinion about all of it. Henry built a proper barn in 1884, larger than the original, with good ventilation and solid construction, a 3-week project undertaken with the help of 2 neighboring farmers, the Calloway brothers, who had moved in 6 miles to the south, and who were the kind of solid, no-nonsense people that Henry had an instinctive affinity with. When the barn was finished, the Calloway brothers and their wives came for supper, and they sat around Olive's table and ate and talked, and Olive watched Henry across the table talking with these people, easy and present and laughing at something Jim Calloway said, and she thought that this was what healing looked like, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the slow and real kind, the kind that looks like a man who has come back all the way home. There was a drought in 1885 that tested everyone in the territory. The summer was long and hot, and the creek dropped, and the kitchen garden required more water than Olive had ever had to give it. Several families further west sold their land and left, and there was a somberness in the county that went beyond the particular crisis to the more general anxiety of people building their lives on a landscape that was reminding them of its terms. Henry had seen drought in mountain country. He had seen the way fire could take what drought had prepared. He managed their water and their land with a steadiness that Olive found, even at the time, remarkable in its practicality, not because it was without worry, but because the worry was always accompanied by action, always accompanied by the clear-eyed assessment of what was actual and what was possible. They did not lose the garden, and they did not lose any animals. They shared what water they could with the Calloway brothers, who returned the favor in labor when the fence on the north pasture needed replacing in September. The drought broke in the autumn with 3 weeks of steady autumn rain that left the land saturated and the creek running high again, and there was in Caldwell Creek a collective exhale, so significant it was almost audible. Olive sat on the porch in the October rain that first evening, and listened to it, and felt the particular gratitude that is only available to people who have worked through the difficult months before the relief arrived, the gratitude that knows what it is grateful for and why. In 1886, Olive was offered the position of school superintendent for the county district, a job that had not existed the year before and which placed her, administratively, over 4 schools rather than 1. She thought about it for 2 weeks, walking her school building and thinking about Frances Aldridge, who had grown from an earnest and slightly overwhelmed young teacher into a genuinely good one, and thinking about the 4 students she was currently teaching who needed her specific attention, and thinking about what it would mean to influence education across the county rather than within a single room. She talked to Henry about it one evening after the children were in bed. She laid out both sides of it with the precision she always brought to things, what it would mean for the school, what it would mean for the county, what she would gain and what she would give up. He listened completely, which was his way, and then he asked her 3 or 4 questions about the practical details, what the position actually entailed, how much time it would require, what support structure it had. Then he said, "What does it feel like when you imagine saying yes?" She thought about it. "It feels right," she said, "like a thing that has been coming toward me that I was always going to have to be ready for." "Then say yes," he said, "just like that." "You've already decided," he said. "You're just making sure I'm with you. And are you?" He looked at her across the kitchen table where they had had 100 conversations, where they had built this marriage in the slow and honest way of 2 people who believed that everything worth having was worth taking seriously. "Olive," he said, "I have been with you since October of 1878. She reached across and covered his hand with hers. She accepted the position. The following years were full in the way of a life that has found its proper dimensions. Olive's work expanded to include visits to the 3 other district schools, consultation with the County Board of Education, and the occasional terrifying communication from the State Education Office in Topeka that required careful diplomatic handling. She was good at the job in all the ways she had been good at teaching, by paying close attention and by being clear rather than merely persuasive. And the schools in the district improved in measurable ways during the years she oversaw them. Henry's guiding work had shifted by the late 1880s to something closer to land surveying assistance, working with the county assessor's office during the summer months to help map the sections that were still imprecisely recorded. His knowledge of the territory was more complete than anyone else's within 30 miles, and the work used his skills in a way that suited both him and the land. He still kept the cabin solid and the barn full and the garden going, and he still walked his 40 acres in the evening sometimes, alone or with Samuel at his side, going around the property with the attention of a man who loves a place and wants to know every part of it. Samuel, at 10 years old, had developed an interest in animals that was more specific and serious than a child's general affinity. He wanted to know about the elk that Henry still described from his mountain years, and about the behavior of the hawk pair that had taken up residence in the cottonwoods on the east edge of the property, and about why the creek ran differently in the spring than in the fall. Henry answered all of these questions with the same precision he brought to everything he knew, and Olive watched the two of them sometimes. This large, quiet man and this serious, dark-eyed boy, walking together along the creek bank in conversation, and the sight of it was one of the most purely happy things she had in her collection of purely happy things. Alina, at 7, was currently of the opinion that the most interesting things in the world were horses and mathematics, in that order, and she had organized her life accordingly. She spent as much time as was permitted with the horses, and she had, the previous spring, worked out a multiplication problem on the schoolroom slate that had startled Frances Aldridge sufficiently that Frances had come to tell Olive about it with an expression of genuine educational excitement. Olive had looked at the problem and said, "Yes, that's correct," with appropriate calm, and then gone outside and stood in the schoolyard for a moment being privately and enormously proud. On a Saturday in October of 1889, 11 years after Olive Collins had arrived in Caldwell Creek with a trunk and a set of teaching credentials, and taken the last seat in the back row of the town meeting, the town held its largest civic gathering in its history. A celebration of Kansas's 30th anniversary of statehood, combined with the completion of the new county courthouse, and the opening of the expanded school building that Olive had worked with the county board to fund over 3 difficult years of budget negotiations. The gathering was held in the meeting hall, which had been enlarged twice since 1878 and could now accommodate most of the county's population if they stood close together. There were speeches, inevitably, because there are always speeches at these things, and there was music and food, and the particular celebratory quality of a community that is taking a moment to look at what it has built and feel good about it. Olive sat in the back row. Old habits do not change when they are also honest preferences, and she saw things clearly from the back. She always had. Henry sat beside her. He had not sat beside her at every gathering over the years. Sometimes he sat in the back corner and she sat in the back row, and there was a chair or two between them. But tonight he sat directly beside her, their shoulders touching, comfortable in the way of a long and genuine love. Samuel was sitting with the Callaway boys and their children, 3 rows forward, looking older than 10 in the way that children who have been taught to observe sometimes look, already cataloging the room with those dark eyes. Alina was with Frances Aldridge on the other side of the hall, having been deposited there with specific instructions about behavior that Olive had delivered with precision, and Alina had received with the particular expression of a 7-year-old who agrees with the spirit of the instructions and reserves judgment on the specifics. Mayor Whitfield, who had held his position for 11 years and showed no particular sign of relinquishing it, stood at the front and spoke about what Caldwell Creek had become. He spoke well, better than usual, because the occasion had given him something real to describe, and his description of it was mostly accurate, which was all you could fairly ask. He talked about the railroad and about the school and about the courthouse and about the families that had come and stayed and built things. He did not say anything about the families who had come and failed and left, or about the dry years that had driven some of them out, or about the Osage land that this whole valley had been before any of them arrived, though Olive thought about that and had thought about it often in her 11 years here. The injustice of it so fundamental and so present that there was no single gesture that addressed it, only the ongoing obligation to be honest about it, to teach it honestly to children, to not pretend the land had been empty before they came. She thought about what it meant that the town was standing in this hall congratulating itself on a history that was also someone else's history, the people whose names the creeks and trails still carried, the names that the settlers had borrowed without permission. She thought that one of the things she had tried to do in her school was make sure that children knew the full story, not only the part that was comfortable to tell, and she thought that was perhaps the most important thing she could offer. Not the spelling and the mathematics, though those mattered too, but the habit of honest accounting, The belief that you could not understand where you were going if you did not honestly understand where you had been and what it had cost others. Henry beside her was very still with a stillness she recognized as the same kind she had seen in him at the first town meeting 11 years ago, taking everything in, not committing to any specific response but filing everything carefully. She put her hand in his without looking at him. His fingers closed around hers. When the official portion of the evening ended and the fiddles started and the children were released from their obligations to sit still, Alina materialized at Henry's elbow with the focused purposefulness of a child who has identified exactly what she wants. "Papa," she said, "will you dance?" Henry looked down at his daughter with the expression he reserved for her specifically, a combination of complete helplessness and absolute devotion that Olive found quietly hilarious and enormously moving in equal measure. "I don't dance particularly well," he said, which was still true and would apparently always be true. "I don't either," Alina said, which was both accurate and irrelevant to her request, and she held out her hands in the manner of a person who considers this matter already settled. Henry stood up. He looked at Olive. Olive said, "Go." He took Alina's hands and they moved onto the floor with the combined imprecision of a large man who had never fully mastered the reel and a 7-year-old girl who made up for technical deficiency with absolute enthusiasm. And the sight of them was so entirely, perfectly itself, that Olive sat in the back row of the Caldwell Creek meeting hall and felt her eyes fill up. Not with sadness, not with anything approaching sadness, but with the overwhelming abundance of having a life that was this specifically and exactly good. Samuel appeared from somewhere and sat beside her with the quiet comfort of a child who had absorbed his father's understanding that proximity was sometimes more eloquent than speech. "Is Papa good at dancing?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "Is Alina?" "Also no." "Is it important?" She watched Henry lift Alina briefly off her feet as they turned, watched Alina's face split into the kind of laughter that children have not yet learned to modulate, complete and unconditional. "Not in the slightest," she said. Samuel considered this. "Okay," he said, satisfied, and sat beside her watching his father and sister dance badly and joyfully in the middle of the Caldwell Creek meeting hall on a Kansas October night. Olive looked around the room that she had first entered 11 years ago as a newcomer with a single trunk. She saw Francis Aldridge talking with 2 of the county board members about the school expansion, gesturing with the particular enthusiasm of a person who has a very good idea and knows it. She saw Jim Calloway and his wife by the food table, Jim laughing at something she had said. She saw Reverend Stokes, older and thinner, standing with a cup of punch, and looking on everything with the benign satisfaction of a man who had presided over enough of the community's life to feel ownership of its happiness. She had come here with nothing but her credentials and her savings and her belief that her own usefulness was sufficient foundation for a life. She had built more than she had planned, which was not because the plan had been insufficient, but because the plan had not accounted for Henry Keene, for the particular, improbable rightness of finding someone who occupied the back of every room with the same careful purpose she brought to it. Someone whose silences were full rather than empty, whose patience was not the patience of passivity, but the patience of deep attention and considered commitment. She thought about the carved quartz piece, which sat on the windowsill in the bedroom of the cabin, still catching light 11 years later, the small, careful flower on its face, a record of winter evenings and patient wanting. Henry returned from the dance floor, Alina riding on his arm with the posture of someone who has conquered a territory, and he sat beside Olive, and Alina was immediately absorbed by a group of children near the door and disappeared into their orbit, and Henry looked at Olive and she looked at him. He said nothing. He did not need to. She leaned her shoulder against his and he put his arm around her, there in the back row of the Caldwell Creek meeting hall, where they had both, on a September evening in 1878, sat alone in the last chairs and noticed each other across the empty seats, 2 people who understood that some things were seen best from the back, and that the most important things were worth seeing clearly. The music kept going. The hall kept its light against the October dark outside. Samuel fell asleep beside his mother, tilting sideways in the gradual, boneless way of sleeping children, and Henry reached across and put a steadying hand on him, automatic and certain. Outside, the Kansas sky was doing what it always did, which was being enormous and full of stars and entirely indifferent to human events, but also, in the way of all great natural things, providing the exact right backdrop for them, the scale against which everything that happened beneath it was measured and found small and meaningful and brief and extraordinary. In the spring of 1890, Olive planted a rose along the south side of the cabin porch, a hardy climbing variety that the seed merchant in town said had a reasonable chance of surviving Kansas winters if properly mulched. Henry built it a trellis that was more substantial than a rose technically required, because he built things to last, because he had always understood that durability was a form of care. By summer, the rose had begun its slow progress up the trellis in the determinedly alive way of things that have found the right place for themselves. Olive watched it from the porch in the mornings with her coffee before the house woke up, in the particular early quiet she treasured, while Henry's breathing was still audible through the window above her, and the children were still asleep, and the prairie was beginning its daily conversation with the light. She was 36 years old. She had the school district and the 2 children and the 40 acres and the rose and the man who had built the trellis. And she had, she thought, every single thing she had not known to plan for, which was the better category, which was the category that contained the life she was actually living. The cabin door opened, and Henry came out with his own coffee and stood beside her on the porch and looked at the rose on the trellis in the morning light. And he said nothing because there was nothing specifically that needed to be said, and she said nothing for the same reason, and they stood there in the good silence that was their native language. The silence of 2 people who have chosen each other deliberately and thoroughly, and continue choosing each other every day in the specific and ordinary and irreplaceable ways of a genuine life. A meadowlark started up somewhere in the grass beyond the fence. The cottonwoods along the eastern edge of the property were full and green, and moving slightly in the early breeze. Samuel's voice drifted through the open window, sleepy and half-formed, calling for no one in particular in the way of children surfacing from dreams. Henry put his arm around Olive's shoulders and she leaned into his side, and they watched the morning come in over their land together. And the whole of what they had built was present in that moment. Not as an inventory, not as an accounting, but simply as the felt truth of a life that was exactly what it should be, tended to every day by 2 people who had found each other in the back row and had the good sense, and the patience, and the willingness to stay.